Welcome back to Inside the Philippines. Most of the stories we tell on this channel follow a recognizable shape. A man arrives. He meets someone. Things move fast. The money starts going. You know the shape. You've seen it here enough times to spot the turns before they come. Today's story is different. Today we're talking about Brendan, 63 years old, Cork-born, Limerick settled. Spent the better part of 20 years on a corporate IT help desk in the Midwest of Ireland. Not a romantic. Not a risk-taker. The kind of man who researches a washing machine for 6 weeks before he buys it. Brendan did everything right. He read the forums. He made the spreadsheets. He gave himself a cooling-off period before booking the flight. When he arrived in the Philippines, he wasn't chasing a woman or a fantasy. He was, in his own words, just looking for somewhere to put himself. And that is exactly what makes this story worth your time. Because what happened to Brendan didn't happen because he was foolish. It happened because he was careful in all the ways that turned out not to matter, and unprepared in the one way that did. This one's going to stay with you. Here's his story, in his own words. Right. Where do I even start with this? I suppose I should tell you about the spreadsheet first. Not the Philippines spreadsheet. That came later. The one before that. The medication spreadsheet. Jovan was diagnosed in 2020. Breast cancer, stage 2, caught reasonably early, prognosis decent enough that we thought, well, we thought what you think in that situation. That it's bad, but manageable. That if you do everything correctly, you come out the other side. I'm in IT support, 22 years of it. What I do, fundamentally, is take a broken system and fix it. You read the error message. You isolate the variable. You apply the solution. You document what you did so it doesn't happen again. That's the job. That's how I think. So when Siobhan got sick, I built a spreadsheet. Consultant appointments on one tab, medications and doses on another, chemotherapy cycles, side effects, blood work results. I drove her to every appointment. I read every leaflet. I asked every question the doctors probably got tired of hearing from me. I was thorough. I was prepared. I genuinely believed, that if I managed it carefully enough, we'd be all right. She died in November 2023, 4 years after the diagnosis, 18 months after it stopped being manageable. The system crashed, and there was no recovery partition. That's the only way I know how to say it that doesn't make me sound like I'm trying to be poetic. I'm not trying to be poetic. That's just what it felt like. The house sold in February 2024. Had to. I'd lived in that house with Siobhan for 31 years. Every room had her in it. The kitchen, the garden, the particular creak of the third step on the stairs that she never let me fix because she said it was useful. Told her she was daft. She said she always knew when the kids were sneaking in late. Kids were 40 and 37 by the time she said that. Didn't matter. She kept the creak. I couldn't stay in it. My daughter Aoif is in Dublin. My son Ciaran is in Vancouver. Good kids. They came for the funeral, stayed for 2 weeks, helped me sort through things, took what they wanted to keep. Then they went back to their lives, which is exactly what they should have done. I'm not saying that with any resentment. They had jobs and partners and their own grief to deal with. I just want to be accurate about what the situation was. The situation was 1-bedroom rental flat in Limerick, $155,000 in a bank account, 63 years old, optional job, nobody queuing up to log a ticket. I wasn't in a bad way, exactly. I wasn't lying on the floor. I got up every morning. I made my tea. I read the news. I went for walks along the river. I was fine in the sense that nothing was visibly wrong with me, But there's a particular kind of uselessness that sets in when you've spent your whole life being useful to someone. To Siobhan, to the department, to the kids when they were small and needed ferrying about and helping with maths homework. I was always the man with a solution. That's who I was. And then, very suddenly, there was nothing left that needed solving. I found the YouTube channel at about 2 in the morning, late October 2024. I wasn't sleeping well, hadn't been for months, which I knew was normal and didn't make it easier. I'd been watching something else, I don't even remember what, and it came up in the recommendations. Fella walking around Dumaguete. Calm voice, good production, not flashy. Showed an apartment, 2 bedrooms, clean, modern enough, sea views of sorts, for the equivalent of about €900 a month. Showed himself at a restaurant eating something called sinigang. Said it cost him less than €4. Talked about the weather. Now, I want to be clear about something. I am not a man who sees a YouTube video at 2 in the morning and books a flight. That is not who I am. What I did was open a new spreadsheet. I spent 3 months on it. Joined the expat forums. There are several, varying quality. A lot of men on them who are either very happy or very bitter, and not much in between. Read archived threads going back to 2019. Compared Cebu, too big, too much like a city I'd already left, to Davao, southern Mindanao. Security situation probably fine, but I'm cautious by nature. To Dumaguete, which kept coming up as the sensible choice for someone my age. University town, quiet, Silliman Hospital for health care, which I verified had the equipment to handle the things most likely to go wrong with a 63-year-old man. Expat community present, but not overwhelming. I looked up the SRRV visa, Special Resident Retirees Visa. Requires a deposit of $20,000 into a Philippine bank, which you get back if you leave permanently. Looked up the exchange rate history going back 5 years. Noted the trajectory of the cost of living based on what people in the forums were reporting versus what the YouTube channels claimed, which were not always the same number. I gave myself the cooling-off period, 60 days between the decision to go and the actual booking. Rule I've had for 20 years. Applied it to the washing machine. Applied it to every car I've ever bought. Applied it to this. Booked the flight in December. Flew out in January 2025. 2-month reconnaissance, tourist visa, no commitments. I want to tell you what Dumaguete is actually like, because I think a lot of the content online, including the channel that started all of this for me, sells you a version of the place that's accurate in the facts and wrong in the feeling. The cost of living is real. I'm not disputing that. You can eat well for €4. You can rent a decent apartment for a price that would make an Irish person emotional. The weather is warm without being oppressive on the coast, and the people are genuinely friendly. I'm not saying that as set up for something darker. It's just true. What nobody told me was how quiet it is to be a foreign man eating alone. There's this thing that happens. You go into a carinderia, little local canteen, plastic chairs, food under glass, and on one hand, nobody pays you any attention at all. You're just another customer. But on the other hand, you are absolutely visible in a way that's hard to describe. You're the only Kano in the room. You don't know what you're ordering. You point at things and hope for the best. And the woman behind the counter is patient with you in the way that people are patient with someone they've decided is harmless. It's fine. It was fine. I'm not complaining. I just want to be honest that the forums spend a lot of time talking about the cost of a 2-bedroom apartment, and almost no time talking about the texture of sitting in it alone. I ate at the same 2 restaurants for 2 weeks because I knew how to order in them. That's the level of adventurousness I was operating at. It was Ernesto who changed that, eventually. But that's the next part. Ernesto lived in the annex attached to the guest house. Retired secondary school teacher, taught history for 35 years at a school up near Silliman University. Quiet man. Not one of those expat-adjacent locals who attaches himself to foreigners for reasons you eventually have to think about. He was there, in the mornings, sitting outside his door with his coffee. And after about 4 days of nodding at each other, we started talking. His English was perfect, obviously. Better than mine, probably, in terms of grammar. He'd correct himself mid-sentence in ways I found oddly reassuring. Precise man. We got on. I mentioned the restaurant situation to him on about the 9th day. Not as a complaint, just as a fact. Said I'd been eating at the same carinderia on Purtis's Street every lunch, because I knew how to point at the right things, and there was a place near the boulevard I wanted to try, but I couldn't work out the ordering system. He looked at me the way teachers look at students who have asked an unexpectedly reasonable question, and said he'd take me there on Thursday. He did. Proper sit-down place, family-run. They did this sinigang na hipon, prawn sinigang, that I still think about. Sour broth, tamarind base, vegetables I couldn't name but ate anyway. Ernesto told me what everything was. I took notes, which he found either admirable or alarming, he didn't specify. We went for coffee after, at a place near Robinson's Place. He asked what I was doing in Dumaguete, whether I was just visiting or thinking about staying. I gave him the honest answer. Said I was doing a proper assessment, 2 months, seeing whether it made sense to retire here. He asked what had brought me to the Philippines specifically, rather than somewhere else. I told him about Chauvin, not the whole thing, not right away. Just that she'd died, that the house was sold, that I needed to be somewhere different from where I'd been. He nodded and didn't say anything for a moment, and then he said his wife had passed 7 years ago. Heart attack. 3 days in hospital, and then she was gone. He said the first year he'd barely left the house, and the second year he'd painted the whole thing top to bottom for no reason he could explain, and by the 3rd year he'd started to feel something like himself again, though a different version, a quieter one. I thought about that for a while. He mentioned, a few days after that his neighbor ran a catering business from her home, said she was a good woman, widowed, worked hard. I think the way he mentioned it was neutral, just information, the way you'd tell someone about a shop nearby. I didn't think anything of it. Then, one afternoon, I came back to the guest house, and there was a container outside my door. There was a note tucked under it. Handwritten, neat. Said, "Ernesto says you don't know how to cook rice properly. This is adobo. Heat it on low. Gloria." I stood in the corridor for a moment, holding this container, not entirely sure what had just happened. In Ireland, a stranger leaving food outside your door would suggest either a very unusual neighborhood or a gas leak emergency. Here it seemed to be hospitality, civic correction, both. The adobo was chicken. I heated it on low as instructed. Ate it with rice I made incorrectly, as usual, and it was the best thing I'd eaten since I'd arrived. Maybe longer than that. I knocked on Ernesto's door the next morning to ask about returning the container. He told me Gloria's house was 2 streets away, gave me rough directions, said she'd probably be home until 10 before she started deliveries. I want to be accurate about my state of mind walking over there. I was not going to meet a woman. I want to be clear about that, because I know how this sounds in the context of a channel like this one. I was returning a container. That was the full extent of my intention. Her house was a standard Dumaguete residential place. Concrete, painted yellow, small covered porch with a table and 2 plastic chairs. There was a smell coming from inside that I eventually identified as something frying in garlic. A rooster was making a strong case for itself somewhere nearby, which I'd got used to by then. Took about a week. She came to the door in an apron, holding a wooden spoon, which I mentioned because it meant she was clearly in the middle of something, and I'd arrived at an inconvenient moment. She didn't seem bothered by this. Gloria. 56, I found out later. Medium height, practical manner, hair pulled back. Not what the forums had prepared me for, which is, I'll say it plainly, the forums have a certain type of woman in mind when they discuss Filipinas, and Gloria was not that type. She was just a person standing in her doorway on a Tuesday morning with a wooden spoon. I handed back the container and said it was very good. The adobo, thank you. She said good, and asked if I wanted coffee since she was making some anyway. I said yes, which I think surprised both of us slightly. We sat on the porch. The coffee was instant, Nescafe, the way they drink it here, sweeter than I'd normally have. The rooster had moved on. There was a jeepney going past at the end of the street, painted in about 14 colors, playing something that might have been a religious song or might have been a love song. The melody was ambiguous. She asked about Ireland. Direct question, no preamble. What's it like? I told her cold, mostly. Wet. Green, genuinely. The green is real. It's not a tourism invention. She said she'd seen photographs, said it looked peaceful. I said it is. And then I said, though I didn't entirely mean to, that peaceful and good are different things, and sometimes you need a break from peaceful. She looked at me in a way that suggested she understood this without needing it explained. She told me about the catering business. Started it 6 years ago after her husband died. Stroke. He was 51, which is too young for that sort of thing by any reckoning. She'd done some cooking for a hotel before that, learned enough to go out on her own. Office lunches, small parties, the occasional company event. She had a woman who helped her 3 days a week, a girl from down the road. She had 3 children. Mentioned them the way you mention facts. Her eldest, Maricel, was a nurse working in Riyadh, sent money home every month. Her youngest, Mylene, was in her 2nd year of nursing at Silliman. Her son Ray ran a hardware stall at the public market. I noticed, at the time, that she told me about her children before she told me anything else about herself. I filed that away without knowing quite what shelf to put it on. I stayed about 40 minutes. When I left, she gave me a small bag of pan de sal from that morning. Said she always made too much. I said thank you, said she shouldn't have. She said it was nothing. We both knew the social arithmetic of that exchange was comfortable and correct. I walked back to the guest house past a sari-sari store with a hand-painted San Miguel sign and a basketball court where 4 teenage boys were playing a game that appeared to have no referee and no fixed rules, but enormous commitment. The pan de sal was still warm. I thought, that was a perfectly ordinary interaction between 2 adults who have both had some hard years. And then I thought, I've extended the stay already. I should book the extra 2 weeks tonight. I did. Both things were in my head at the same time, and I want to be honest about that. I flew back to Limerick on the 28th of February, as planned. Had a return ticket. Kept the return ticket. That was the deal I'd made with myself. The flat was exactly as I'd left it, which sounds obvious, but somehow wasn't. I'd half expected it to have changed in some way, the way you expect a place to acknowledge that you've been somewhere else. It hadn't. Same view of the car park. Same dripping tap I'd been meaning to report to the letting agent since October. Same silence. I rang Awaif that Sunday. Told her the trip had gone well. Said the cost of living was roughly what I'd expected. The healthcare situation was acceptable. I was considering going back. She asked sensible questions. What about the visa? What about language? What about if something happened to me over there? I answered them all correctly. I didn't mention Gloria. There was nothing to mention, I told myself. A woman who'd given me adobo and pan de sal. Not a story. I thought about her anyway. Not romantically, exactly. Or not only that, it's hard to be precise about it. More like the way you think about a conversation that went better than you'd expected. She was straightforward. She didn't perform anything. I'd been around enough people performing things in the past year, performing concern at the funeral, performing normality afterward, performing their own discomfort at not knowing what to say to a widower, that somebody simply sitting on a porch and asking what Ireland was like felt, I don't know. Notable. The 60-day cooling-off rule. I applied it. I gave myself until the end of April. I booked the flight on the 22nd of April. Limerick to Manila. Manila to Dumaguete. I told Awif I was going back for a second assessment. She said, okay. She's a sensible woman, Awifi. Doesn't push. I sent Ernesto a message saying I'd be back in early May. He replied within an hour, said that was good news. There was a new place near the pier doing fresh-caught fish he wanted to try. That was the extent of the sentimentality. It suited both of us. I did not send Gloria a message. I want to be accurate about this sequence of events. I did not contact her before I arrived. She knew I was back within about 36 hours anyway, because Ernesto told her, obviously. She appeared on the third morning with a container of kare-kare, oxtail stew and peanut sauce, which sounds strange and is wonderful, and the same expression she'd had the first time, which was that of someone completing a routine task rather than making a gesture. I had the container back within a week. I knocked on her door. She invited me in for coffee. This became, gradually, and without any explicit discussion, a pattern. Coffee on the porch, 2 or 3 times a week. Sometimes she was in the middle of prep for a catering order, and I'd sit at the kitchen table while she worked, and we'd talk while she chopped things or checked whatever was on the stove. She had a particular way of cooking that was very efficient. No wasted movements, everything in its place before she started. And I found this genuinely pleasant to watch. I have a professional respect for competent process. We talked about ordinary things mostly. She told me about a difficult client who'd ordered 40 portions of pancit for a birthday party and then disputed the quantity on delivery. I told her about a project manager I'd once supported who genuinely believed that turning a computer off and back on again was a form of data loss. She found this funnier than I expected. She had a good laugh, Gloria. Not performed. Just when something was actually funny, she laughed at it. Mylene came home one afternoon while I was there. The nursing student. 21. Serious face. Slightly shy with me at first in the way that younger people can be when they're not sure of the situation. She said, "Good afternoon, Poe," which is the polite form, and Gloria introduced me as Ernesto's friend from Ireland. I noted the framing. Not her friend, Ernesto's friend. It struck me as careful without being cold. Mylene sat with us briefly before going upstairs to study. She was preparing for a clinical rotation at Silliman Hospital. She mentioned it with a matter-of-fact seriousness that I recognized from Awifa at that age, that particular young person intensity about something they've chosen to be good at. I liked her. And then Ray came by one Saturday morning, the son with the hardware stall. Bigger than I'd imagined from Gloria's descriptions, stocky, quietly evaluating, the handshake slightly longer than necessary. Not unfriendly. Careful. He drank his coffee and asked me a few questions about Ireland in a way that was clearly designed to establish what sort of man I was, rather than any genuine curiosity about Irish geography. I answered honestly. He nodded. We didn't become friends, but we arrived at a tolerable mutual understanding, which was probably the best available outcome. The relationship, if I'm calling it that, and I wasn't calling it that yet, internally, had a quality I'd struggled to find in the previous year and a half. It was useful. I know that sounds strange as a description of something between two people, but I mean it precisely. She had things to do. I was present while she did them. Occasionally, I was helpful in small ways. Drove her to the Gaisano Mall when she needed to pick up a large supply order and couldn't get a tricycle big enough. Waited outside with my phone, helped carry things back. Practical contributions. That was the texture of it. I renewed my tourist visa through an extension at the Bureau of Immigration office on Purtice's Street in early June. The process took most of a morning, involved a significant amount of waiting, and cost $3,030, about $50 for a 2-month extension. I'd read about this on the forums. It matched what I'd been told. I noted this in the spreadsheet under visa costs. I was still updating the spreadsheet. The first time money came up directly between us was a Tuesday in late June. She mentioned, not as a request, I want to be clear about the framing, because it matters. She mentioned that Mylene's second semester fees were due in 3 weeks, and that the timing was awkward because she had 2 catering bookings cancel in the same month. She said it the way you'd mention a logistical inconvenience to someone you trusted with information. Not an ask. More like sharing a problem. I asked how much. She said $85,000, about $1,400. I thought about it for maybe 10 seconds. I said I could help with that if it was useful. She said she'd pay it back when the bookings picked up. I said, don't worry about it. She did not cry. She did not say God had sent me. She said, thank you, very quietly. And then she changed the subject to whether I'd tried the new grilled fish place near the pier, yet because Ernesto had mentioned it twice, and she was starting to think we should just go and see what all the fuss was about. I went home and updated the spreadsheet. Under a new column I hadn't had before, which I labeled simply Contributions, $85,000. $1,400. I told myself it was a one-off. I signed the lease on the apartment on the 15th of May. Ground floor unit in a small residential building on Sibulin Road, about 10 minutes walk from the boulevard. 2 bedrooms. I didn't need 2 bedrooms, but the price difference was small enough that it seemed sensible to have the space. $22,000 a month. Roughly $360. I had the landlord, a retired engineer named Mr. Catalan, show me every tap, every socket, every door hinge before I signed anything. He found this thorough. I found it standard. I moved out of the guest house, thanked Ernesto, and we agreed to continue the coffee arrangement, which we did. It didn't require discussion. I want to give you an accurate picture of what the months from May to September actually felt like, because I think it's important, and because the forums don't describe it honestly. They describe the cost of living. They describe the weather. They describe, at length, the social dynamics of meeting women. What they don't describe is how genuinely settled a person can feel in a place after 3 or 4 months, in a way that has nothing dramatic about it, nothing you'd put in a post. I had a routine. Morning coffee at the apartment, walk along the boulevard before the heat got serious, sometimes breakfast at a small place near the public market that did champorado, this rice porridge with chocolate, which sounds wrong and is oddly good. Then, whatever the day required. I was still processing the SRRV application at this point. That required its own schedule of trips to the accredited agent's office, phone calls, document requests. My Irish pension documentation needed an apostille stamp, which required correspondence back to a government office in Dublin, which took 6 weeks longer than it should have because of an address discrepancy I spent 2 days sorting out from 7,000 kilometers away. Familiar enough frustration. A system behaving badly for no clear reason. I fixed it eventually. Gloria and I had, by this point, settled into something that had a shape to it, without either of us having drawn that shape. 3 or 4 evenings a week, I'd walk to her house, or she'd come by the apartment. We'd eat. She cooked, usually. Though I was improving, she'd started teaching me to manage rice properly, which she treated as a minor public health initiative. And we'd talk. Sometimes Mylene was there studying at the kitchen table. Sometimes Ray would appear for dinner, and we'd sit together without much ceremony. The first time I stayed the night was in late July. I'm mentioning it because it changed the texture of things, not because the details are anybody's business. What I mean is, after that, the relationship had a different weight. We both knew it. We didn't discuss it particularly, which was, I'd come to understand, very much the Filipino way of handling things. You don't have the conversation. The situation simply becomes what it is, and both parties acknowledge it through behavior rather than declaration. I was fine with this. I come from a country where feelings are expressed primarily through actions and the careful selection of what not to say. We understood each other on this point without ever discussing it. What I did not fully understand was the extent to which, in Filipino culture, a man in my position had already taken on a particular role within a family system. Not a boyfriend exactly, not a husband. Something that didn't have a clean equivalent in my frame of reference. The closest I can get to it is, I had become a reliable resource, a stable external support. The way an OFW, an overseas Filipino worker, one of the millions of Filipinos working abroad and sending money home, functions for their family. I was local rather than overseas, but the structure was the same. Gloria's family had identified me, correctly, as someone with capacity to help, and in their framework, someone with capacity to help and awareness of need who does not help is making an active choice not to fulfill an obligation. The word for this is utang na loob, debt of gratitude, though that translation loses something. It's closer to a moral weight, a ledger that exists whether you've agreed to keep it or not. I didn't know any of this in July. I knew the term from the forums, but I'd filed it under potential warning signs to monitor, rather than understanding it as a description of water I was already in. The nursing fees came up again in August, Mylene's third semester. This time the amount was $88,000. Fees had gone up slightly, plus there were additional clinical materials required. About $1,120. I noted that the previous semester's fees had been $85,000, so the increase was real but small. I checked this. That's the kind of man I am. I cross-referenced it. I contributed without being asked directly. I want to be precise about that. Gloria mentioned the fees were due the following week, and that the timing was tighter than usual because a large catering booking had paid late. She said it the same way she always said these things, as information, not request. I said I'd transfer the amount. She thanked me. We moved on. Rodrigo was the next one. Gloria's younger brother, 53, lived in Sibulan. He started having abdominal pain in early September, went to the local health center, got referred to a private hospital in Cebu for what turned out to be gallstones requiring surgery. The estimate from Chonghua Hospital in Cebu was $155,000 for the full procedure, roughly $2,180. Gloria had $40,000 saved toward it. Maricel, the daughter in Riyadh, sent $15,000. That left $100,000 unaccounted for. Gloria showed me the hospital paperwork, referral letter, diagnosis, Surgical estimate, all of it. I read every page, checked the hospital name. Changhua is a real hospital, well regarded, exactly where you'd go for something like this. Everything was in order. I transferred $100,000. That's approximately $1,600. And here is the thing I want to be honest about, because I think it matters for anyone watching this. I did not feel manipulated at that point. I felt useful. There was a problem. I had the capacity to address it. I addressed it. That's the job. You read the error message, you apply the solution. It felt familiar in a way that, sitting here now, I can see was part of the problem. I was pattern matching the wrong template. Rodrigo sent me a text message the day after his surgery. Thanked me. Said, "God bless you, Kuya," which means older brother, a term of respect. Nice man. I've met him twice since. He's fine. The surgery worked. By late September, the running total in my contributions column was just over $540,000. At the exchange rate that month, that was approximately $8,600. I had $155,000 to start with. I'd spent roughly $6,000 on rent, $3,000 on living costs, $800 on visa fees, and associated nonsense. Call the total expenditure to date around $18,400. I had approximately $136,000 remaining. The spreadsheet said I was fine. The spreadsheet was not wrong exactly. That's the thing. The numbers were accurate. What the spreadsheet didn't have a column for was trajectory. It showed me where I was. It didn't show me the slope. October arrived, and with it, the typhoon season proper. I'd read about this, had a tab in the spreadsheet for it. Dumaguete sits in a reasonably protected position geographically. The Visayas take the worst of it. But you still get the outer bands, the heavy rain, days where the sky turns a particular shade of yellow-gray in the afternoon, and everyone goes quiet in the way that people who've lived with weather their whole lives go quiet. Gloria's sister, Perla, lives on the island of Negros, about an hour and a half by road from Dumaguete heading north. A typhoon that tracked through in mid-October caught the coastal barangay where Perla's family lived. Not a direct hit. A direct hit would have been significantly worse. But enough. Part of the roof came off the house. Water damage throughout. Perla's husband was a fisherman, not working during the storm season, no income coming in. Gloria told me on a Thursday evening. We were at her kitchen table. She'd made a fish sinigang. The radio was on in the background. She had a photograph on her phone that Perla had sent. The interior of the house, with a gray sky visible through a gap where the roof had been. Water stains down the walls. A plastic basin on the floor catching drips. She said the repair estimate was $60,000, about $960. She had $15,000 set aside. She wasn't sure where the rest would come from. She said it in the same tone she said everything. Flat. Factual. Not performing distress. Not angling. Just, here is a problem that exists. I said I'd cover the difference. She looked at me for a moment. Then she said, "You don't have to do that, Brendan." And I said, "I know." And that was the conversation. I transferred P45,000 to Gloria's G-Cash that evening, roughly $720. She sent it on to Perla. Perla's husband arranged the repair through a local contractor the following week. I saw photographs of the finished work. Solid enough job. New corrugated roofing, properly sealed. I added it to the spreadsheet. Contributions column. Running total now approximately P625,000. Somewhere around $10,000 since May. And here is where I have to be careful about how I describe what happened next, because it's easy to make it sound like a series of demands, and I don't think that's what it was. I want to be accurate. November. Mylene's fourth semester fees. P91,000. Nursing fees had a standard annual increase plus new clinical equipment requirements for her hospital placement at Silliman. I contributed $25,000, 1,200. Gloria covered the remainder from catering income. December. Christmas. This is important context that nobody tells you before you come here. Christmas in the Philippines is not a private family matter. It is a civic event that runs from September through January and involves obligations I hadn't fully mapped. There is pasalubong, the expectation of gifts when returning from anywhere. But at Christmas, this becomes something larger. Gloria's family gathered. I was present, which meant I was participating, which meant there were costs. Food for a large gathering, which Gloria organized and I funded. $12,000, $190, for the lechon alone, ordered from a place her cousin recommended near the market. Gifts for Mylene, for Ray's 2 children, for Perla's kids who came from Negros. I bought these at Robinson's Place. A salesperson helped me. I spent approximately $18,000, $290, across everyone. It was a good day, genuinely. I want to say that honestly. There was a lot of food and a lot of noise, and the children ran around a basketball court outside until it got dark, and someone put on music, and the adults drank San Miguel and talked about things I only half understood. And Gloria sat next to me and occasionally translated something she thought I'd find interesting. I liked it. I'm not going to pretend I didn't. I also spent about $500 that day that I hadn't specifically planned for. January 2026. Ray's hardware stall had a difficult quarter. Slow sales in the lead-up to Christmas, which apparently happens because people deprioritize hardware spending in favor of food and gifts. And then a supplier payment came due in January before the post-holiday uptick. He needed $40,000, $640, to cover the supplier gap, or he'd lose the account. Gloria mentioned this. I contributed $25,000, $400, and said Ray should cover the rest himself if he could. He did. Ray and I had a slightly different conversation after that. Not confrontational. Nothing here is ever confrontational. That's one of the things you learn. But he came by the apartment one evening, sat down, drank a San Miguel, and said, in a roundabout way that took about 15 minutes to arrive at its point, that he appreciated my help, and that I was a good man, and that his mother was— He paused here. His mother was happy. He said the word carefully, like he was handing me something fragile and watching to see if I'd hold it properly. I said I was glad to hear it. He nodded, finished the beer, left. I sat with that conversation for a while afterward, the bit about his mother being happy. Because she was, I thought. I believed that. I still believe it. She wasn't performing happiness at me any more than she'd performed anything else from the start. When Gloria was content, she was quiet and present, and occasionally laughed at something I said that I hadn't intended to be funny. When she wasn't content, she was also quiet, but differently, a slightly contracted quality to it. She was happy, and she had 11 people in her family system whose financial stability now ran partly through her, which ran partly through me, and I had arrived into that system without a manual and agreed to terms I hadn't read, because no one had showed them to me, and that was, both things were true simultaneously, and I didn't know what to do with that. February 2026. The SRRV application finally cleared. 14 months after I'd started the process, the accredited agent called to say the documentation had been approved, and I could proceed to the deposit stage. The under 55 rate requires a $10,000 USD deposit. I was over 55, which meant the standard retiree rate, also $10,000, held in a Philippine bank, fully refundable if I chose to leave permanently. About $9,200 at the rate that month. I sat with the deposit form for 3 days before signing it. Not because of the money, In isolation, $1,900 is significant, but manageable. I sat with it because signing it felt like a different kind of commitment than any of the others. The rent was monthly. The contributions were situational. The SRRV deposit was structural. It said, "I am formally a resident here. This is the plan." I think about those 3 days, what I was actually deciding. I signed it. By the end of February 2026, my total expenditure since arriving in January 2025 was approximately $48,000. Rent and living costs, roughly $14,000. Visa fees and associated costs, including the SRRV deposit, $10,500. Contributions to Gloria's family, approximately $23,500. I had started with $155,000. I had approximately $107,000 remaining. The spreadsheet still said I was fine, and I probably was, in some narrow technical sense. But I'd started doing something in January that I hadn't done before. I'd added a new tab. Not contributions, not costs. I called it projection. I put in the average monthly contribution rate for the previous 6 months, approximately 1,650s. I projected it forward 5 years, with a modest annual increase of 10% to account for the general trend I'd observed. The number at year 5 was not fine. I closed the tab and didn't open it again for 3 weeks. I reopened the projection tab on a Tuesday morning in early March. Made myself a coffee first. Sat down at the kitchen table in the apartment on Sibulin Road. The ceiling fan was going. There was a rooster somewhere outside. There is always a rooster somewhere outside. And the smell of someone frying garlic in the building next door drifting through the window. I opened the tab and looked at the numbers for about 20 minutes without changing anything. Then I saved the file, closed the laptop, and went for a walk. The boulevard in the morning is one of the genuinely good things about Dumaguete. Wide concrete promenade along the water, palm trees, people walking dogs or jogging or just sitting on the benches watching the strait. On a clear morning, you can see the mountains of Cebu across the water. It's about 30 minutes end to end at a normal pace. I'd done it hundreds of times by this point. I knew the cracks in the path, the bench with a wobbly leg, the part near the middle where someone had painted a small mural of a banca outrigger that was surprisingly good. I walked to the end and back, and then I sat on a bench and watched a man trying to teach his small son to ride a bicycle, which took considerably longer than either of them had planned, and then I went back to the apartment and opened the spreadsheet again. There was an expat I'd seen around, though not spoken to much. British fella, Martin, retired, had been in Dumaguete for going on 15 years. Married to a woman from Sibulan. Seemed settled, seemed sane. Not one of the bitter ones who corners you in a coffee shop to explain why everything is a scam. You get those? There are several in every expat community. Best avoided. Martin wasn't that. He came to the occasional gathering at an Irish-owned pub near the port that a small group of us attended on Friday evenings. Quiet man. Said what he thought without performance. I ran into him on a Wednesday afternoon at a coffee shop on Perdices Street. Just happened to be there at the same time. Ordered at the same counter. Ended up at adjacent tables. We got talking. At some point, I don't remember exactly how it came up. We'd been talking about the SRRV process, I think. I'd mentioned the paperwork delays. He asked how I was getting on generally. I said well enough. He asked if I was seeing someone. I said I was, yes, a woman named Gloria, who ran a catering business. He said, oh, right, and nodded in a way that suggested he knew who she was. I asked if he knew her. He said he'd been around long enough to know most people. Said she was a good woman. Hard life. Lost her husband young, raised the kids largely on her own, built something decent from nothing. He meant it. It wasn't set up for something darker. He genuinely thought well of her. And then he said, almost as an aside, the tone of someone mentioning something they assume you already know, that he supposed she had a lot of people depending on her. Her daughter in Riyadh sending money. And now me as well. He said, that's how it works out here, you know. You become an OFW without the flights. He smiled when he said it, like it was a known thing, a recognized category. He moved on to a different topic. Said his wife wanted to go to Manila for her sister's birthday in April, and he was trying to work out whether to go or send her alone. I nodded and said something about Manila traffic. Normal conversation. But I wasn't listening to the rest of it properly. I was running the phrase back. An OFW without the flights. An overseas Filipino worker. That's the term for the millions of Filipinos who leave to work abroad and send money home every month, structured and regular, because the family depends on it, and the family comes first, always. That's not a criticism. It's a system that functions, and that millions of people live inside of because poverty and love and obligation are sometimes genuinely the same thing. And I was, from the perspective of Gloria's family economy, functionally one of them. Not an individual in a relationship, a remittance source with a residency visa. I didn't go to Gloria's that evening. I sat in the apartment and opened the spreadsheet and added a column I should have built much earlier. I called it Annual Trajectory, and I worked backwards from everything in the Contributions tab, month by month, and then I built the forward projection properly. Not the rough one from January, a proper one, with realistic assumptions about family size, the number of dependents, typical Filipino household financial pressures, medical costs, education, the general fragility of income for a catering business, the ongoing reality of a fisherman brother-in-law in a typhoon-prone coastal barangay. The number at year 5, done properly, was $82,000 in contributions alone, on top of my own living costs, from a starting capital of $155,000, of which I now had approximately $107,000. I sat with that for a long time. The thing that made it hard, and I want to be very honest about this because I think it's the part that's most useful to someone watching this. The thing that made it hard was that nothing had been fabricated. There was no other man. There was no fake emergency I could point to. Every receipt was real. Rodrigo's gallbladder scar was real. Perla's roof was real. I'd seen the photographs. Mylene would graduate in 18 months and be a qualified nurse, and that was real too. Gloria cared for me. I believed that then, and I believe it now. When I was ill for 4 days with a stomach bug in August, she came every day, brought congee from the place near the market, sat with me, was not performing concern. She cared, and she had 11 people whose lives were better because I was in them. And she had understood, far earlier than I had, that this would be the shape of things. Not because she was calculating, because this was simply the water she lived in. The structure of obligation and care and family support that had been her entire life, and into which I had walked through an open door holding a container of adobo. I wasn't deceived. I hadn't asked the right questions. Which is different, but not entirely different. I rang Iwife that Thursday. First honest call I'd made to her since arriving. I told her most of it. The money, the family, the projection. She listened without interrupting, which cost her something, I could tell. When I finished, she was quiet for a moment, and then she said, "Dad, what do you want to do? Not what should you do? What do you want to do?" I said I needed to come home for a bit and think. She said, "Okay." I told Gloria the following morning. Sitting at her kitchen table, coffee on the stove, Mylene's nursing textbooks stacked at one end of the table as always. I said I needed to go back to Ireland for a while to deal with some things. I didn't itemize the things. She nodded, said she understood. She didn't cry or plead or ask when I'd be back. She made me a container of adobo for the journey, which she knew I couldn't take on the plane, and which I think she knew I knew, and which was? I don't know what it was. It was just what she did. I left the apartment sublet to a Silliman University lecturer for 3 months. I did not close the SRRV. I packed one bag. I flew out on a Tuesday. Dumaguete to Cebu, to Manila, to Dublin, to Limerick. 21 hours. I slept through most of the Manila to Dublin leg, which I'd never managed before. I didn't look at the spreadsheet for 2 weeks after I landed. The Limerick flat was smaller than I remembered. That's the first thing. I'd been in a 2-bedroom apartment for 10 months, and coming back to the rental felt like putting on a coat that had shrunk in the wash. Same car park view, same dripping tap, still not fixed. I reported it on day 3 out of pure reflex. A wife came up from Dublin the first Saturday. We went for lunch at a place on the river she likes. She asked how I was. I said I was grand, which is the Irish answer that means anything from genuinely fine to actively drowning, and she knows me well enough to know it meant something in the middle. We talked about it properly. I told her the full financial picture, which I hadn't done on the phone. $155,000 starting. Approximately $55,000 spent in total across 14 months. Rent, living costs, visa fees, SRRV deposit, and contributions to Gloria's family. $100,000 remaining. She listened. Didn't say I told you so, which I appreciated, and she also hadn't told me so, which I also appreciated. When I finished, she was quiet for a moment, and then said, "So you're not ruined?" I said, "No, not ruined." She said, "But you're not where you thought you'd be, either." I said, "No, not that, either." We ordered dessert and talked about her kids for a while. Normal conversation. It helped. I want to give you the actual numbers clearly, because I think that's the useful part of this. One started with $155,000. I spent $34,000 in direct contributions to Gloria and her family over 14 months. I spent a further $21,000 on my own rent, food, transport, and living costs in Dumaguete. The SRRV deposit of $9,200 is technically recoverable if I formally relinquish the visa, which I haven't done. So the real loss, if you want to call it that, is approximately $55,000, of which $34,000 went to Gloria's family for purposes that were all genuine, documented, and real. I'm not ruined. I want to be clear about that. I have $100,000 and an Irish state pension of roughly $1,050 a month that I can draw in about 18 months when I turn 65. I'm not a cautionary tale about a man who lost everything. I'm a cautionary tale about a man who lost a third of what he had, without fully understanding the terms of the arrangement he'd entered. The distinction matters. I spent the first month back in Limerick not thinking about the Philippines very much, which was a deliberate choice. Walked the same routes I used to walk with Siobhan. Went to the library. Had coffee with a couple of people I'd let drift while I was caregiving, and then again while I was away. Ordinary things. The dripping tap got fixed on week 2. Small satisfaction. In May, I had a conversation with myself that I'd been avoiding. Not about Gloria. About me. About what I'd actually gone looking for when I found that YouTube channel at 2 in the morning and decided to build a spreadsheet about moving to the Philippines. I'd been looking for usefulness. That's the honest answer. I wanted to be useful to someone again. Siobhan had needed me completely for 4 years, and then she didn't need anything anymore, and I didn't know what to do with the capacity I had left. Gloria's family needed things. Real things. Rodrigo needed a gallbladder operation. Maylene needed tuition fees. Perla needed a roof. I had the capacity, and I applied it, and it felt, for a long time, exactly like what I was looking for. The problem wasn't that I was exploited. The problem was that I was useful in a way that had no natural ceiling, in a system I hadn't understood, and I'd mistaken the feeling of being needed for the feeling of being part of something sustainable. Those are different things. I know that now. I'm still in contact with Gloria. Message exchange, not daily, but regular. She asks how Ireland is. I ask about Myleen's clinical placement. I don't know what it is, exactly. It's what it is. She hasn't asked me for anything since I left. I don't know if that's consideration or strategy, and I've decided it's not useful to spend time trying to work out which. I haven't canceled the SRRV. I haven't made any formal decisions. So, if you're watching this because you're thinking about retiring in the Philippines, here's what I'd tell you. Build the spreadsheet, yes. Do the research, do the forums, check the healthcare, visit first, twice if you can. All of that is right. But build a second budget. Build the family budget. Not as a line item called other costs. Understand it structurally. Understand that in Filipino culture, a person with capacity and awareness of need who doesn't help is making an active moral choice not to help, and that you will be expected to have capacity because you have a pension and savings and you came from a country where those things exist. That expectation is not malice. It's not a scam. It's a different moral operating system, and it's been running in that country for generations before you arrived, and it will keep running after you leave. If you can afford to be part of that system, and you go in with clear eyes and set limits, you can actually maintain, not limits you set to feel responsible and then abandon the first time someone needs a roof. Then, maybe it works. Some men live that life and are genuinely content. Martin's been doing it for 15 years. He seems fine. But if you're going there because you're lonely and you want to be needed, and you think careful planning will protect you from your own emotional requirements, know this: the spreadsheet will tell you what things cost. It won't tell you what you're willing to pay. I'm 63 years old. I have $100,000 and a pension coming. The apartment in Dumaguete is still sublet. The SRRV is still active. I'm thinking about going back. That's the honest end of the story. I don't know yet in what capacity. That's Brendan's story. And I've been doing this channel for a while now, and most of the stories we tell here have a clear villain, and a clear victim, and a clear lesson. Brendan's doesn't. Quite. And I think that's why it's worth your time more than most. He wasn't deceived. He wasn't scammed. He walked into a genuine relationship with a genuine woman who had a genuine family with genuine needs, inside a culture where the obligation to provide for that family is not a manipulation tactic. It's the moral fabric of how people live. And he didn't know that. Not really. Not in the way that matters. The content that sent him there, the YouTube channels, the forums, the retirement guides, showed him the cost of a meal and the rent on an apartment. None of it showed him the second budget, because the second budget doesn't make for a good thumbnail. If you're planning a retirement move to the Philippines, and many of you watching this are, please understand one thing that Brendan had to learn the hard way. The cost of living figures you'll find online are accurate and incomplete at the same time. They tell you what life costs. They don't tell you what belonging costs. Know the difference before you book the flight. This has been Inside the Philippines. Take care of yourselves out there.